For the last 8 years, I've been doing a humor experiment. Whenever I speak to an organization, I send out a cartoon like this ahead of time and ask people to send in captions. I like that you can have one image and everybody sees something just a little bit different. In this case, who is wielding the chainsaw and why? I've done this with many different types of groups all over the world, and I find it fascinating to see what they come back with. Let me play devil's advocate. I'm done trying to finesse the glass ceiling. Please raise your arm high in the air if you disagree with my idea. This is the last time I'm going to ask you to make the logo bigger. I think it immediately surfaces some of what's really going on in an organization. It's like a funny version of a Rorschach test. That's the qualitative part of the experiment. But what I find even more interesting is the quantitative part. On average, there's roughly a 25% response rate. So for 100 attendees, 25 captions. But there's really wide variability. Some organizations are extremely prolific with wide participation across the board, people even drawing all over the cartoons like this. And then other organizations are like pulling teeth. And the few that trickle in, people ask to remain anonymous. And it made me wonder why some organizations are more prolific than others. And after spending time with them, my hypothesis is that it has nothing to do with how funny or creative the people are who work there. I think it has everything to do with culture and the culture of the organization, how comfortable people feel being open with each other, sharing ideas, talking about what's really going on. And I think that what gets in the way is fear. And I think it's exactly the same fear that keeps us from trying new things, keeps us stuck in the status quo, holds us back from doing our best work. And I think that a sense of humor is one of the most important but completely overlooked tools in business. And if we really want to overcome that fear, we have to learn how to laugh at ourselves. Laughing at ourselves is powerful in 3 ways. The first is a sense of belonging. This is something that I learned as the only cartoonist at Harvard Business School. When I first got to campus, I was worried that I was an admissions mistake. I thought it was just a matter of time before everybody else figured that out, too. And I had drawn cartoons as a kid, and as a coping mechanism, I started drawing cartoons again for the student paper. This is how I imagine professors looked at all of us students in class. And that's me trying to keep my head down, drawing cartoons, hoping that I didn't get found out. And as a student, it made me feel a little bit more comfortable to put those out there. I didn't fully appreciate that drawing cartoons about teachers might actually make me more of a target. But sure enough, when I walked into one of my first classes after publishing cartoons, it was one of our most stressful classes, the professor kicked things off by suddenly projecting my cartoon on the big screen. And for a moment, I felt that fear physically. And I sat there in shock, and then the laughter started. People started laughing, and then we were all laughing, and it became this magical shared experience. And then the professor used that to segue to me to get me to start the class. But at that point, I was no longer afraid. I felt like I belonged in that room. And cartooning really taught me the power of belonging. For the next 2 years, I was the class cartoonist. And my friends would come to me with their stories of stressful job interviews or classes that were stressful. We would bond over the same inside jokes. And humor gave us a way to talk about them. I learned that many of us felt like we were admissions mistakes. And by the time I graduated, I no longer felt like an admissions mistake. I joined a big company working in marketing. Suddenly, I felt like a hiring mistake. And because I had drawn cartoons before, I turned to cartoons again, this time about my marketing life. And we need to stay focused on our marketing priorities and not get distracted by every shiny new, look, squirrel. And I didn't have a student paper anymore, and this was before blogging or mainstream social media. So I set up a simple website with an email newsletter, and I just started drawing once a week something that I was going through as a marketer. This was our compromise with legal. And in doing that, I started to find that many of us were finding the same experiences. And suddenly I felt like I belonged. I used to send out the cartoons during the workday. And the moment I hit send, this phenomenon would start. And people's heads would pop over the cubicles like prairie dogs. And we would bond over those experiences. And it taught me the second power of laughing at ourselves. It's disarming. It lets us talk about things that are otherwise hard to talk about. Instead of risking anything new, let's play it safe by continuing our slow decline into obsolescence. Around this time, my colleagues started to wonder if I would be fired. I thought I might be fired, and sure enough, I eventually got a call from the assistant to the chief marketing officer asking me to come in for a little chat. So I backed up my files, and I went. But he surprised me by not firing me. He took me to lunch. He told me what his favorite cartoons were. He told me I needed to keep doing that I was saying what needed to be said. And so for the last 16 years, I've done that every week. And when I asked you to think outside of that box, I forgot to ask you to think inside of this box. And it became something that I could publish once a week. It started small with just my friends. It's now read by over 100,000 people a week. It eventually followed me to other companies and ultimately to my own company. One manager told me that if he ever ended up in a cartoon, that I would be fired. And another told me that if he didn't end up in a cartoon, I would be fired. We have to do more with less. And over time, I started to cover topics more generally. As somebody working in marketing, I was always trying to think about things that would come along. How do I process that? When Google acquired Nest and everybody was trying to make sense of the Internet of Things, I drew this cartoon to try to make sense of it all. I think my Nest smoke alarm is going off. Google AdWords just pitched me a fire extinguisher and an offer for temporary housing. And along the way, it became a way for me to make fun of myself as somebody working in marketing. How do I process and grapple with all of these challenges and then connect with other people who are trying to do exactly the same thing? Don't worry, it's only marketers collecting our personal data so they can create more relevant advertising for us. There's an organization called the Humor Research Lab, or HURL for short. And they're working on a theory that they call benign violation. So a real peeping Tom in your window would be considered a violation. A cartoon scenario is pretty benign. And the overlap is what unlocks the humor. It's a theory for describing why things are funny. And I think the benign violation theory of humor also relates to how humor can be effective at letting us talk about things that are otherwise hard to talk about. It gets around our defenses because we need to talk about the things that are violations, and humor gives us a way to do that. And that brings me to my third point about the power of laughing at ourselves. It lets us be vulnerable. So 8 years ago, this week, I left my job to draw cartoons full-time. And my wife and I decided to start a business to help organizations tell stories and solve problems with cartoons. We recently worked with a company, a large financial organization in Singapore, and they were trying to be more entrepreneurial. They realized that there was cultural baggage that was getting in the way. And so they commissioned a series of cartoons to lightly parody their work culture. It's a pretty vulnerable thing to do. And when I talked to people in the company, I noticed that the same word kept popping up, scolded. They talked about being scolded for making a mistake. They talked about a fear of being scolded as a reason for playing it safe. And that word is such an interesting word. It made me think of old school teacher-student relationships. So I started playing around with the concept involving dunce caps, sort of an early American form of humiliation in classrooms where misbehaving students would have to wear a paper hat. But no one in the Singaporean team had ever heard of a dunce cap. It's such an American reference. And so I asked them, what does the word scolded make you think of? And then an executive started describing that when she was a student, if somebody would misbehave, they would be asked to stand up in front of the class. They would have to cross their arms, hold their earlobes, and squat in front of everybody else. And the moment she started describing this, all I could hear was laughter. And it was a conference call, so I couldn't see what was going on, but somebody eventually sent me this photo. And there were executives, grown adults, standing up and suddenly doing this in their conference room. And it eventually inspired this idea. Does anyone else have a hypothesis they'd like to test? But I think the real magic happened in that room when executives let their guards down. They were being vulnerable. And that vulnerability touches on what I think so often gets in the way, fear. A fear of looking foolish, a fear of being scolded. And I think that fear is particularly acute when an organization is in a state of change, when it needs to move from one place to another. It's inherently uncomfortable to move away from the status quo. And I think that humor makes us feel more comfortable being uncomfortable. And yet, humor is either implicitly or explicitly discouraged in business most of the time. Stanford Business School is trying to address that. They've recently introduced a brand new course that's all about the power of humor in business. The name of the course is Serious Business. And Professor Jennifer Aker and lecturer Naomi Bagdonas inviting comedians and other funny people to come into the class and talk about the power of humor. They believe that they've noticed a trend where adults around the age of 23 start to lose their sense of humor. According to Professor Jennifer Aker, there's a Gallup poll that looked at 1.4 million people across cultures, and they rated them against certain prompts such as, I believe I'm a funny person, and I laugh frequently. And the results dropped precipitously around the age of 23. And so in their class, they talk about a phenomenon they've described as the humor cliff. And they're trying to encourage people not to fall off it, and instead to hold on to their innate sense of humor. And more importantly, to create environments that allow others to retain their innate sense of humor. One of their guests is a former Apple executive named Hiroki Asai. And Hiroki realized that humor could be a powerful weapon. And so he used to challenge himself in every all-hands meeting to make the thousands of people on his extended team laugh. His specialty involved self-deprecating videos. And here's how the class sums up the lesson of his example. Fear kills creativity, and humor is our most powerful tool to drive fear out of the system. The very thing that makes us feel like we can't laugh at ourselves is what gets evaporated when we do laugh at ourselves. And that creates a special environment where we feel like we belong, where we can say it like it is, where we can be our true selves, where we can draw a cheeky cartoon without fear of being fired, where we can hold our earlobes and squat in a room full of executives, where we can submit a cartoon caption without wanting to remain anonymous, where we feel comfortable talking about the chainsaw in the room. Thank you.